Chapter 7 Life on My Own. Murdstone and Grimby's warehouse was on the waterside. It supplied many different goods to ships that sailed to both the East and West Indies. Men and boys were employed to examine bottles against the light and throw away those that were imperfect. The bottles had to be washed and labels pasted onto full bottles, or corks had to be fitted to them, or finished bottles packed in caskets. This was my work together with two other boys. At 12:30 on my first day, Mr. Cannone tapped the window and told me to follow him. He introduced me to a stout middle-aged man with a bald head and a large smiling face. His clothes were very shabby. "This is Mr. Micawber," said Mr. Cannone to me. "Mr. Micawber is a friend of Mr. Murdstone. You are to be a lodger in this house." Mr. Micawber told me his address and then offered to come back at 8 o'clock to collect me. After he had left, Mr. Cannone paid me my first salary of 6 shillings a week in advance. Mr. Micawber arrived at 8 o'clock as promised and took me to his home. He introduced me to Mrs. Micawber, a thin woman with a baby in her arms. There were 2 other children in the room, a boy and a girl, aged about 3 and 4. Mr. Micawber showed me to my room at the top of the house. It was very small and badly furnished. Mrs. Micawber then told me about Mr. Micawber being in financial difficulties. "If Mr. Micawber's creditors will not give him time," said Mrs. Micawber, "they must accept the consequences. You can't get blood from a stone." Mr. Micawber's creditors visited the house at all hours of the day and night. They were quite angry and banged on the door loudly. I passed my leisure time in this house with this family. My own breakfast of a penny loaf and a penny worth of milk I bought and paid for myself. In a small cupboard I kept another small loaf and a small piece of cheese for my dinner when I came home from work. My 6 shillings didn't last long, and I often would buy myself a stale pastry for half price on my way to work. I was young and inexperienced and should have kept the money to buy my lunch. I didn't know how to make my money last a whole week. When I wrote to Peabody, I didn't tell her of my miserable existence. I didn't want to worry her. A friendship formed between the Micawbers and myself, even though they were adults and I was just a child. One morning, Mrs. Micawber came to me and said, "Master Copperfield, you're no stranger, and I feel I can tell you about our difficulties. Apart from a bit of cheese, there is nothing to eat in the house." I was very uncomfortable with this information and offered Mrs. Micawber the 2 or 3 shillings that I still had in my pocket. Mrs. Micawber kissed me and told me to put the money back in my pocket. "No, my dear Master Copperfield," she said, "I cannot take your money, but you can do something for me if you don't mind." She asked me to take some of the valuable items she still had to the pawnbroker and borrow money against them. I agreed to help her and did so regularly for some time until Mr. Micawber's difficulties came to a crisis. He went bankrupt and was arrested early one morning. On the first Sunday after the arrest, I went to visit Mr. Micawber. I ate with him in his little room and stayed for the afternoon. I went home and told Mrs. Micawber of my visit. Gradually, everything in the Micawber house was sold to help the family, and eventually Mrs. Micawber decided to move into the prison with Mr. Micawber. I rented a little room close to the prison so that I could visit the Micawbers, as they were still responsible for me. All the time I worked at Murdstone and Grimby's, I became shabbier and shabbier. I had no friends and led a secret, unhappy life. I am happy to say that Mr. and Mrs. Micawber lived more comfortably in prison than they had out of it, which stopped me worrying about them. After 6 weeks in prison, Mr. Micawber was released, and he and his family left London and moved to the countryside to make a fresh start. I shall never think of Mr. Micawber's difficulties without thinking of you, Master Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber. You have always behaved kindly to us. You have never been a lodger, you have always been a friend. I thanked her for her kind words and said I was very sorry they were leaving. On his last day in London, Mr. Micawber arrived at my place of work to speak to Mr. Cannon. Mr. Micawber explained that he was leaving London, so I had nowhere to live. Mr. Cannon introduced me to Mr. Tip, who was a married man and had a room to let, and it was agreed that I should go and live with him and his wife. Before he left, Mr. Micawber said, "My dear young friend, I am older than you and am a man of experience. I have nothing to give you except advice. My advice is never do tomorrow what you can do today. My other piece of advice, Copperfield, is this: annual income £20, annual expense £19, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expense £21, result misery. Remember that." The next morning I saw the whole family off on the coach to Plymouth. I decided that I didn't want to work at the warehouse anymore and planned to run away. I would go to the country and tell my story to my aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood. I don't know how or why I thought of this plan, and I didn't know where she lived, but I wrote to Peggotty and begged for a half-guinea. I said that I would repay it and tell her later what it was for. Peggotty's reply with the half-guinea arrived quickly. She told me that Miss Betsy lived near Dover, but she didn't know the exact address. I decided to leave at the end of the week and managed to find a man with a donkey cart who agreed to take my box to the Dover coach office for a few pennies. My box never arrived at the coach office. I set out on the road to Dover towards my aunt's house with only 3 halfpennies in my pocket. My experience with the Micawbers was very useful, and at the first chance I took off my waistcoat and sold it in a little shop for 9 pence. Even though it was worth much more, I wondered if I would also have to sell my jacket, and arrived in Dover in just a shirt and a pair of trousers. I decided to make my way to Salem House School and sleep in the haystack outside. I shall never forget the lonely feeling of lying down without a roof over my head. At first light, I crept away just as Mr. Creakle's boys were getting up, and I began my long, dusty way to Dover. That Sunday I walked 23 miles, arriving in Rochester, hungry and tired. I didn't want to spend the little money I had, so I spent another night under the stars. I walked about 20 miles a day, buying bread and sleeping rough outside. When my money ran out, I went to a shop to sell my jacket. A dreadful dirty old man was standing in a grubby shop. "Oh, what do you want?" the old man said, grinning. "I wanted to know," I said, trembling, "if you would buy a jacket." He seized me by the hair and I handed over my jacket. "Oh, how much do you want for the jacket?" he asked. "Half a guinea," I answered. "Oh no, 18 pence," he replied. I agreed, as I was anxious to end the argument. He then tried to persuade me to exchange my jacket for a fishing rod or a fiddle. I told him that I wanted the money. At last he began to pay me a halfpenny at a time. When I got outside, I realized that he had paid me 4 pence less than the agreed price. I spent 3 pence on some food and drink and limped along the road on my way to Dover. When I reached Dover, no one seemed to know where my aunt lived. I spoke to many people before a kind man said, "Trotwood? Let me think. I know that name too. Is she an old lady?" I said that my aunt was very old. The man pointed and said, "Go that way until you come to some houses facing the sea. She lives somewhere there. You may not find her very kind, so here is a penny for you." I accepted the coin thankfully and bought a loaf of bread with it. I walked until I came to the houses facing the sea and went into the shop to ask if anyone knew where Miss Trotwood lived. Inside was a young woman buying rice. She turned and looked at me, saying, "Miss Trotwood is my mistress. What do you want with her, boy?" "I want to speak to her, please," I said. My aunt's maid walked out of the shop, telling me to follow her. We arrived at a neat cottage with a small garden full of flowers. "This is Miss Trotwood's house," said the maid. I looked down at myself. My shoes were in very bad condition. I had no jacket or waistcoat, and my hat was crushed and bent. My shirt and trousers were dirty and worn. I felt very nervous as I waited to introduce myself to my aunt. My aunt came out of the house wearing gardening gloves and waving a large knife in one hand. "Go away," she cried, "go away. No boys here." I held my hat in my hand. "Please, madam," I began. "Please, aunt." Miss Trotwood looked up in surprise. "I'm your nephew," I stammered. My aunt sat down on the garden path in shock. "I am David Copperfield of Blanderstone in Suffolk. You came there the night I was born and saw my mother. I have been very unhappy since she died. I have been neglected and sent out to work. I have only a little education and I have run away to you. I was robbed and have walked the entire way. I haven't slept in a bed since I began my journey." I stopped talking and burst into tears. My aunt got up quickly and took me into her house. She put me on her sofa with a shawl under my head and a handkerchief under my feet to keep it clean. She then rang the bell and called for Janet, the servant girl. "Go upstairs and ask Mr. Dick to come downstairs." A gray-haired, pleasant-looking man entered the room. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "do you remember me telling you about David Copperfield?" "David Copperfield?" said Mr. Dick. "David Copperfield? Oh, yes, of course I do." "Well," said my aunt, "this is his boy, his son. He has run away now. The question is, what shall I do with him?" "His son?" said Mr. Dick. "David's son? Well, the first thing you should do is wash him." "Yes, you are right," agreed my aunt. She called for Janet to run me a bath. The bath was a great comfort, and while I was bathing, my aunt found me a pair of trousers and a shirt belonging to Mr. Dick. When I was clean and dressed, I lay down on the sofa and fell asleep. When I woke up, I looked around the neat room. We sat down to an excellent dinner, and all the time I was worrying about what my aunt was going to do with me. After dinner, I told my aunt and Mr. Dick my story. They asked me a lot of questions, which I answered as truthfully as I could. My aunt was very upset to hear that my mother had married again, and called my stepfather a murderer. When I finished telling my tale, my aunt turned to Mr. Dick and said, "Now, Mr. Dick, I am going to ask you another question. Look at this child. What would you do with him now?" "Do with him?" said Mr. Dick. "I should put him to bed." So I was taken to bed. I noticed that there were no clothes in the room, and as I said good night and climbed into bed, I thought that my aunt might think that I would run away again. My room was at the top of the house, overlooking the sea, and as I drifted off to sleep, I thought of all the lonely nights I had spent under the stars. I prayed that I might never be homeless again.